Hi y'all, thanks so much for checking in with this video. I'm really sorry that I had to cancel class, but what I'm going to try to do is talk you through the rest of the remaining slides as if we had lecture, and then that way you can just watch this video, fill out your objectives, and follow along. So we ended class on Monday talking about the Bob Cialdini video about how to be persuasive, and specifically Bob Cialdini talked about a bunch of different ways in which we can be persuasive. So what I want to start doing now is moving really to elements of persuasion. And so this is going to be our outline for what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this lecture. We're focused on the communicator, who is talking, the message, what they're saying, the method of communication, how they're saying it, and the audience to whom they're saying. So of course, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a ride-sharing club today suggests that if you are riding alone, you're burning more gas and oil than you need, and you're working against the Allies. And so it's as if you are working on the other team, on the Axis side. So, moving on, I want to talk a little bit about the credibility of the source. And of course, Bob Cialdini talked about this. You're much more likely to buy basketball shoes if a famous basketball player tells you to buy them than if I tell you to buy them. So somebody who is an expert is inherently believable because they know a lot. And because they know a lot, they can speak confidently. Now, of course, this can be tricky because we often hear or know of people who speak very confidently, even though they have no idea. Certainly the internet perpetuates this kind of confident speaking. We also know that people are considered credible if they're trustworthy. And some of the ways that we establish trustworthiness would be things like eye contact. So if I look you directly in the eyes, you're more likely to think that I'm being honest with you and that you can trust me than if I sort of dodge away from you. Certainly if I'm arguing against my own self-interest, so if I say something like, we really should reduce the cost of tuition because that's what's right for the students. Well, obviously that's arguing against my own self-interest. The more money the university has, the more money maybe I get paid, the nicer the classrooms are, the better the technology. So if I'm arguing against my own self-interest, then that actually makes me seem very trustworthy. And although I don't do this on purpose, we do think that people who talk fast are more trustworthy because things just seem to come naturally. They say lots of words very quickly, and so we really don't even have time to second guess what they're saying because they're talking so fast. The next part of this, of course, has to do with the appearance of the speaker, and none of you are going to be surprised if you've been following along all semester that we are much more likely to be persuaded by somebody who is attractive. We like attractive people. But more than that even, we like people who are similar to us. So, for example, this is an ad for plastic surgery, and this is a middle-aged white woman. And as much as I am not ready to be there, I don't think of myself as a middle-aged white woman. So if this is advertisement to try to get me to engage in plastic surgery, that looks more like my mom than me, and so I'm not going to see myself in that target. Again, this is exactly why McDonald's has a website for Asian Americans, for Black Americans, for Hispanic Americans, for predominantly white Americans, is because we're much more likely to be persuaded when the person who is trying to persuade us looks like us, and of course then is physically attractive. So the question then becomes, if we're going to pick credibility versus appearance, which is more important? And the answer is if it's a subjective preference. So if it's something like what tastes the best or what movie is the best, then similarity is going to win. So if I'm trying to decide which dentist is the best, the dentist that looks like me is probably going to be the one I'm going to go with. But if it's some sort of fact-based something, like I want to buy a car or I want to invest in a business, then I'm much more likely to go with somebody who is an expert and who is credible and believe them rather over somebody who looks very much like me. The next thing that we need to talk about is the message content, and that's whether we take an emotional appeal or a reason-based appeal. Of course, this harkens back to our conversation about central versus peripheral processing. So obviously, it's going to depend on the audience which kind of message content you want to take. If you are talking to a very highly educated audience, they're probably going to be interested in your reason-based arguments. If you're talking to an audience that is not interested, then your emotion-based arguments are probably going to be better. So it has to do with both education level, but also interest. So when we're talking about the formation of initial opinion, so if I said, here's a widget, how do you feel about widgets? Well, if your initial opinion is formed through emotion, so for example, I say, look at this widget, it's so soft and snuggly, then if I'm going to try to persuade you to like something that's not the widget, I'm going to have to persuade you based on emotion, because you fell in love with the widget because of emotion in the first place. So the same thing is true with reason. If I've convinced you that a widget is a good product to buy because of its price and efficiency, then in order for me to try to convince you on some widget competitor, I'm going to have to go back to those reason-based, data-driven arguments. So one of the things that I like about this study here is that they were really trying to pit this idea of good feelings. They were really trying to show the role of good feelings in influence. And so what they did was they had participants read about an issue. So in this case, curing cancer, supporting our armed forces, taking a trip to the moon, or watching 3D movies. And they either had them do that while they ate a snack that they really liked or while not eating a snack. And what you'll notice is that in each case, if you ate food while you were reading about the issue, you were much more likely to agree with the issue. So when you were doing something that was consistent with what you liked, you associated that. And this is, again, a use of peripheral cues. So if we can get you to do something you like, maybe go to the movies, and then show you an advertisement for something, maybe like a new vacuum, you'll be much more likely to associate that new vacuum with something that you like, the movies, and that will convince you to buy it. Again, that's a very peripheral cue. So this is a very important approach. So going back to this idea of emotions, the question is, what about the emotion of fear? We know that fear makes people more conservative, but does fear have an effect in advertising? And of course the answer is yes. It does really work when what we want to do is encourage detection. So if what we want to do is get people to go out and look for something, say look for cancer, look for a disease, strep throat, HIV, then fear in advertising does work, telling people that if you have the flu, you could die. That gets people to go out and get tested for the flu. But it doesn't work so much with preventing behavior. So if I'm trying to say, well, if you have sex without a condom, you could get an STI, people say, well, that's not going to happen to me. So fear doesn't necessarily work when we see the behavior as pleasurable or when we're trying to prevent something. So we should, if we're going to take this fear approach to persuasion, we're going to try to get people to do something or not do something out of fear. We need to make sure that that persuasive message includes some information about how to reduce the fear. So for example, when we're talking about something like the Surgeon General's warning, and you'll notice that these are on all packs of cigarettes, the U.S. Surgeon General's warning has these pretty general concerns that it lists. So smoking by pregnant women may result in fetal injury, premature birth, and low birth weight, which is objectively specific, but is not particularly vivid. Or quitting smoking can greatly reduce serious risks to your health. Okay, what does that actually look like? Well, contrast that with the Canadian government warnings. And what you have here are pictures of hearts and teeth. I love this one right here. Tobacco can make you impotent. So the cigarette is supposed to be a phallic object that can't get erect. And so you can see that these Surgeon General-esque warnings in Canada are actually much more effective because they're vivid. So if we're going to include this fear, we need to show how to alleviate it. So just don't smoke, for example. But we need to make sure that it's very vivid, not just saying smoking is bad for your health, but specifically what is likely to happen. Showing pictures or making that threat very vivid is going to be very, very helpful. The next thing I want to talk about is the method of communication. So how is it that we actually transmit this persuasive message? And face-to-face influence is going to be much more persuasive. So contrast that with something like an ad on Twitter or a commercial during a football game that you see. That's not going to be particularly persuasive. But if I say to you, hey, y'all, I use Snuggle dryer sheets and they're the best, then when you're standing at Target trying to figure out which dryer sheets, you might think, oh, well, Dr. Brewer uses Snuggle and it's fine for her, so it's probably fine for me. This is what we call this two-step flow of communication. So somebody got to me, and it was that darn Snuggle Bear. Snuggle Bear convinced me that Snuggle brand dryer sheets were for me, and now I'm telling you. So this is what I mean by the two-flow step of communication. Now, certainly it's more complicated than this, but y'all, this is the whole idea of these multi-level marketing companies, things like Mary Kay or doTERRA oils or many of the weight loss shakes. The idea is that I'm not buying from a stranger, I'm buying from my friend. And so if my friend says, hey, I worked for this company and this product has been really great, we think, oh, well, then it must work for me. And part of the reason why these multi-level marketing companies don't have huge advertising budgets is because their employees, their independent contractors, are their advertisers. They don't need to take out an advertisement on the radio to talk about Mary Kay. They just need their Mary Kay salespeople to talk to other people who might want to purchase the product. So this is what I mean when I'm talking about this two-step flow of communication. It's much more likely that we're going to be persuaded by somebody we know than by some sort of advertisement. Just a few things here to talk about the audience. We generally find that when people get older, they are much more resistant to change. And this harkens back to what we talked about with political identity, that when you are young, you are much more likely to be a liberal because you have less to lose, so you're willing to make change. As you get older, you're much more likely to fear the risk that might come with change, and so you don't want to change. So that could be something like, my grandmother uses a Sun detergent. I've never even heard of Sun detergent, but she has used it for as long as she can remember, and despite the fact that it is not a particularly great detergent, she's not going to change because that's what she's always used. Now, research has shown that historically, as long as we've been studying people, it does look like people become less and less likely to change their attitudes and their opinions and be less persuaded over time. But that may not always be true, especially as the baby boomers get older. It may be the case that there are generational things that predict why it is that somebody might actually change their opinion. So perhaps the hippies or maybe the millennials will be much more likely to change when they get older. So although it looks like people are much more likely to change when they're younger, that may not always hold true. The other thing that's important to recognize is that your audience, the person you're trying to persuade, is not a passive receptacle. They are thinking while you're talking. So one of the things they may be thinking about is a counter-argument. If I show up and I say, snuggle the best dryer sheets, you say, dryer sheets are all pretty much the same. Why can't I just use the basic store brand, Target's brand, or Kroger brand? So you might not actually say that out loud, but you might be thinking that. And so if you want to be persuasive, one of the things that you might do is try to take somebody by surprise. So show up at their house, call them on the phone when they're not expecting it. That's a really easy way to try to get somebody to not be able to think of counter-arguments. Another option might be to call them or try to interact with them to persuade them when they're distracted. So it's very likely that you've received a telemarketing phone call when you maybe are at home in the evening, when theoretically if you had children or a family, you might be interacting with them. We're also much more likely to be persuaded when we're uninvolved. So if I'm trying to convince you to donate to the Arts Council of Dallas and you're not from Dallas and you don't really care about the Arts Council, you might just say, okay, yeah, here's $5, get out of my way, I have other things to do. So this is, again, why a lot of times salespeople will call at night, they'll try to talk to people while they're out shopping, because if you're taken by surprise, you have less time to really think of some sort of counter-argument or to say, no, I don't want to buy that, I don't want to be persuaded. So the last thing I want to talk about is just how to resist persuasion. And one way to do that is to strengthen your personal commitment. If I'm trying to tell you something like the earth is flat, you might say, no, I'm actually going to double down on my belief that the earth is round. And so one way you could do that is by challenging your beliefs, by saying, okay, well, what evidence is there for the earth being round? What evidence is there for the earth being flat? Another approach would be to develop counter-arguments. So if you encounter somebody who says the earth is flat, you could say, well, how come when people in the space station are up there, they can see that the world turns? So you can start to develop these counter-arguments so that if you ever encounter somebody who tries to persuade you, you have an arsenal of resources that you can pull out to resist against that. And this is what we call attitude inoculation. The idea is that if you can develop these counter-arguments, they're sort of like little tiny doses of the opposite view. And that allows you to build up antibodies or counter-arguments that you can then use if somebody is trying to persuade you. So I know that this isn't a full lecture, but it does allow me to cover all of the things that I wanted to. Y'all, I really hate to miss our last day of lecture. I anticipate being in class on Friday. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me, and good luck on the exam.